Hey there, welcome to History of Thought 2. And today is our second day or second topic on postmodernism. So today we're going to keep looking at Frederick Jameson's essay, Postmodernism and Consumer Society, and look at his critique of postmodern culture. And then we're also going to be looking at Bell Hooks and a couple of her essays about postmodernism and sort of critiquing capitalist mass culture. So Frederick Jameson, who we talked about last time, sort of in regards to an overall introduction to postmodernism, is still alive. And he is a cultural theorist, a philosopher, and a literary critic who is looking at postmodernism and postmodern culture from pretty much kind of a contemporary Marxist perspective. So he has a particular critique of postmodernism that comes from that. So he argues that postmodern culture, sort of the culture of postmodernism, so not postmodern art, for example, or not postmodernism necessarily as a movement in like the designs and in the arts and in architecture, but that sort of other sense of postmodernism as being this larger kind of zeitgeist, this larger sort of sense of the entire culture, this larger feeling or tendency of the entire culture. That postmodern culture, kind of in the late 20th century and even into the 21st century, is defined fundamentally for Jameson by nostalgia for the past, but not real historic engagement. So for Jameson, postmodern cultural products, the past, the historical past, has been transformed into a series of emptied out stylizations, which he calls pastiche, that can be commodified and consumed. So, so Jameson makes this kind of this comparison between pastiche and parody. Okay, so both pastiche and both parody are about imitation. Okay, but he says that they're different in terms of political connotations. So parody is self-aware, self-reflexive imitation. It plays kind of with existing images and signs in a way that creates a deeper kind of political critique. It may be funny, but the laughter has sort of a critical purpose. I mean, examples, some of these may be outdated, but I mean, an old one is South Park, right? Or The Simpsons, Drunk History, The Colbert Report. I mean, we can think of good parody and biting parody. So sort of in contrast to parody, to pastiche, is parody. Is pastiche. In contrast to parody is pastiche, which is the transformation of reality into images. According to Jameson, the dictionary definition of pastiche is an artistic work in a style that imitates that of another work, artist, or period. So for Jameson, pastiche is really what defines a lot of postmodern culture. It's blank parody with no political bite. So in postmodern times, this would be probably from, the 70s onwards, Jameson claims parody has been replaced by pastiche. Now, obviously, we can find examples of parody in postmodern culture, but he said sort of the overriding tone, the overriding form of postmodern culture is pastiche. He says, quote, pastiche is like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, the wearing of a linguistic mask, speech in a dead language, but it is a neutral place of such mimicry without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satirical impulse, devoid of laughter. So in postmodern culture, we have kind of this nostalgia for the past, for other time periods, for other styles, and we kind of draw on, and you can even say other cultures, right? And we draw on all of this stuff and we kind of mix it up together and create all of these references and all of this signaling to other things and kind of this new sort of product. But it's empty. I mean, what's kind of the point of all of that drawing and all of that referencing? It's just sort of referencing for reference's sake. A great example of this when I teach this class live is I wear this t-shirt. And we spend some time analyzing it, but I think this is a perfect example of pastiche, right? So it's a system of signs, but what's it referring to? The first thing is it's Han Solo, right? So it's a reference to Star Wars. And, it's kind of like, okay, cool, you like Star Wars. It's also a reference to pop art, right? So this is very much in the style of Andy Warhol, right? And the entire pop art movement, which, even though it kind of started in the 60s, is definitely a postmodernist kind of artistic movement. There's also kind of this sense of, since Han Solo is holding the gun, sort of these ideas that circulate in Star Wars fandom, like Han Solo shot first. If you don't know what that is, Google it. So there's kind of these references to a variety of different things, to Star Wars fandom and culture, right? To pop art, to Andy Warhol. Okay, but what does this mean? What's the meaning of this? Is it, making some sort of critical commentary on anything? Is there anything that's being parodied or being sort of commented upon? Or is this just pastiche? In other words, what does it mean when I wear this shirt? Why do I gain pleasure wearing it? And why do others enjoy seeing it? What does it do in terms of kind of our identity? So it's just sort of it's fun, right? I may wear it because people will be like, oh, Star Wars, I know that. Oh, Warhol and pop art, I know that. But is it just kind of this identification of reference and that's it? It's very surface, and the pleasure of it is very kind of surface. And this is really what Jameson is talking about in terms of postmodern culture. And it's these mixing of references too, right? Star Wars and pop art are two very different things. Think about the historical context that's being lost. When does Star Wars come out, you guys? Do you know? When does pop art start? Star Wars is 1977. Pop art, I don't know the exact date that pop art starts, but it's the 60s. Is my knowledge of the historical and cultural context of this film, an artistic movement, and the artist of Warhol even necessary to get something out of wearing this shirt? There's also a deeper kind of capitalist critique too. Who made this shirt? Where did I buy it? Who benefits economically from me wearing it? Sort of in the who owns the trademark? Who owns the image of Han Solo? Who owns sort of the trademark to Warhol-esque? I mean, it would be covered. Ironically, it would be covered probably under exemptions for parody, right? But there's all of these things that Jameson is critiquing that I think is very encapsulated in this shirt, right? I mean, what am I saying by wearing it? Other than I want other people to be like, oh, cool, I know what Star Wars is. Oh, cool, I know what Warhol is. And that's kind of about it, right? There's no point in sort of mixing these references for a deeper satirical purpose. So one of the things that really a lot of pastiche is about, and a lot of larger aspects of postmodern culture, as I mentioned at the beginning, in Jameson's critique, is nostalgia, right? And nostalgia, sort of the dictionary definition, is a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. So, one of the things that Jameson is looking at, and this article, of course, was written in the early 80s, so he's looking at what he calls the nostalgia film and the popularity of films that he deems nostalgic. So Jameson looks at American Graffiti, which was actually George Lucas's, one of his early movies, set in from the mid-1970s, but actually set in the late 50s. So it was kind of nostalgia for the teen years of the people who were adults at that point. He looks at Star Wars as a nostalgia film, even though it's set, it's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but it's a nostalgia. The particular form that it takes is a nostalgia for an older form of science fiction storytelling. Anyway, he looks at a number of different films maybe that you're not as familiar with, Chinatown, Body Heat, but I think, his nostalgia films can even be set in the present time if it's about sort of connecting to a sense of the past or a sense of sort of, a longing for the past. And, I think we can think of all of these different kinds of longings for nostalgia have just gotten even more intense, in current times. I'll talk about that in a second. But Jameson makes the distinction between a nostalgia film and a historical film. So nostalgia film disposes of any notion of referring to a real historical past. Rather, it refers to our images and stereotypes about the past and not any kind of true realism. So nostalgia film for Jameson represents the past for us in a hyper-stylized way. So he looks at how the 50s were represented in George Lucas's 1970s film American Graffiti. He looks at how sort of the 1930s were represented in the 1970s Roman Polanski film Chinatown. He says, in such works, we approach, quote, the past through stylistic connotation, conveying pastness by the glossy qualities of the image, the 1930s-ness or the 1950s-ness by the attributes of fashion. The history of aesthetic styles, thus, displaces real history. And Jameson sees this situation as, quote, a symptom of the waning of our historicity, of our lived possibility of experiencing history in some active way. And I think I think this argument, as I said, applies even more in 2020. What are the nostalgia films of present time, or TV shows or comics or podcasts? I mean, think about the just sort of explosion of comic book movies. I mean, even if set in the present or future, the nostalgia film is really about sort of the longing for this kind of simpler time, even if it was an imagined time. I mean, I know the first thing we think about is Trump, make America great again. But I think, even in sort of centrist or left-wing cultural productions, you still get that kind of nostalgic form. Maybe not a desire for a return to the actual past, but at the very surface, sort of a desire to sort of relive sort of childhood or youth or teenage years over and over, and also for the aesthetics of a previous time period recycled and sort of refurbished over and over. Think about comic book movies and this sort of form, the standard here, the standard kind of superhero story that gets recycled over and over and over again. And it's that familiarity and that recycling and that nostalgia which makes it pleasurable. I mean, the constant stream of remakes, of sequels, of reimaginings, of redoing, our current culture just sort of drips with that longing. And maybe not for any kind of real past, but for the sort of cultural forms of the past. And things that we remember from previous years or previous decades, we want them recycled and reimagined and redone. There's kind of this weird 2-decade nostalgia rule, right? So in the 70s, people long for the 50s, and in the 80s, people long for the 60s, and in the 90s, it was 70s, and so on and so forth. So I don't know are we like nostalgic for the early 2000s now? I mean, that was yesterday. I don't understand. But like the 50s fascination that swept through the 1970s. And there's this huge fascination. It's really the first time you see this. American Graffiti, Happy Days, Grease, these were all movies and TV shows in the 70s about the 50s. And as I said, the obsession in the 60s that coursed through the 80s, Dirty Dancing, The Big Chill, Wonder Years, the sort of the revival of 60s classic rock. The presence of the 70s in the pop culture of the 60s, Dazed and Confused, that 70s show, Boogie Nights. And the 80s wave began and rebuilt in the early 2000s, right? Precisely on time. And even now we see it, you get this 2-decade rule, but you even get, now we just have nostalgia for lots of different decades. I mean, the 80s are kind of back, right? Stranger Things, for example, I think is a nostalgia, not just for the 80s, but sort of a Spielberg-esque constructed 80s, and I'm sure we were nostalgic for the 90s at some point, but I missed it because I lived that, so I'm not nostalgic for it. But why is this kind of nostalgia bad? Why is this kind of nostalgia bad, according to Jameson? I'm going to go full screen now because you guys have read the slide by now. We're longing for an imagined past that was never real. When times were simpler, they never really were. Nostalgia films mean we cannot focus on and nostalgic culture, recycled culture, rebooted culture, culture that's constantly, even if it's remixing it and redoing it, but that's constantly borrowing in a very surface way. right? It means we can't actually focus on our present time. We can't achieve aesthetic representations of our own cultural moment for Jameson. And this is kind of a huge indictment of consumer capitalist society. We can't deal with time and history anymore. It's not what we want to consume. Only rejumblings, only these sort of surface pastiche rejumblings and reconfigurations are possible. And Jameson says when innovation is no longer possible, all that is left to do is recycle and imitate old styles. So one thing we can talk about is Jameson's critique fair? Is Jameson's critique fair? I mean, there's all these great things that we talked about in terms of postmodernism, in terms of, kind of critiquing a lot of the aspects of the Enlightenment that had kind of become the dominant narrative, and giving voice to sort of diversity of perspectives and sort of deconstructing the notion of absolute truth, which, that can go both ways. But, Jameson is kind of having us say, all of that is great, but if you actually kind of look at the content of a lot of cultural production, just sort of mainstream mass cultural production in postmodern times, it really all has this sort of veneer of surface pastiche and nostalgia. And what does that mean? That we can't achieve sort of an aesthetic representation of our current moment without some kind of recycling of the past. So, we can talk about if that's a fair critique or not. And we can also ask, what does nostalgia do in terms of being able to imagine the future? So much, I think, like science fiction that is in contemporary times, and Jameson actually, a lot of his cultural criticism in his other works is about science fiction and sort of the possibility of science fiction. But why don't we imagine what a utopian future will look like anymore? I mean, think about the promise of the Enlightenment, Marx's dream of communism, lots of other large-scale utopian projects during the era of modernism that are attempting to sort of re-engineer society to make it better. I mean, when we think of that now, we think we sort of gasp in horror. Re-engineering society, we know where that's going to go, right? Utopians are by default, sort of in contemporary renderings of them, really dystopias. Right? So why now are we so obsessed? This is something that Jameson is interested in other essays. Why are we so obsessed with the future as dystopia? And a dystopia that is often about criticizing trends in our current societies that will lead to dystopia. I mean, there's an important critical element there. But, there's a famous sentence by Frederick Jameson: it is easier to imagine for us right now in postmodern culture the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Why does dystopia sell? And why do we want to consume it? So maybe that's something that we can talk about in terms of, alienation and commodity fetishism and all that stuff in our class where we talk about postmodernism. So I want to move on from Jameson, but the one thing that I think kind of encapsulates his critique of postmodern culture is a trailer for the film Ready Player One. So I'm going to show the trailer. And then we can talk about it in class, and then we'll move on to bell hooks.
My name is Wade Watts. My dad picked that name because it sounded like a superhero's alter ego, like Peter Parker or Bruce Banner. But he died when I was a kid, my mom too. And I ended up here. Sitting here in my tiny corner of nowhere. There's nowhere left to go. Nowhere. Except the Oasis. A whole virtual universe. People come to the Oasis for all the things they can do. But they stay because of all the things they can be.
Can you feel this?
Well, yeah. It's the only place that feels like I mean anything. The Oasis was the brainchild of James Halliday.
Hello. If you're watching this, I'm dead. I created a hidden object, an Easter egg. The first person to find the egg will inherit $500 billion and total control of the oasis itself.
Who is this Parzival, and how the hell is he winning?
Find him.
This isn't just a game. I'm talking about actual life and death stuff.
The Oasis.
The world's most important economic resource.
And it's nothing less than a war for control of the future.
Welcome to the rebellion, Wade.
Like many of you, I only came here to escape. But I found something much bigger than just myself. Are you willing to fight?
Help us save the Oasis.
Hold on. So we can talk some more about Ready Player One in class, but I think, it even though it's technically set in the future, in a lot of ways it really kind of encapsulates sort of this pastiche, the kind of recycling of all of these different elements, from cultural production of the past and sort of our sense of what the past was like, and music, even though it's set in the future, right? It's these cultural forms that have been recycled over and over again. And, in kind of this dystopian future, right? That we're consuming, and the question being like, what's the pleasure in consuming this movie at this particular cultural moment? And Jameson would have a pretty strong critique of that, so we can talk about his critique. So moving on to the second critique of postmodernism, if you want to take a break, now would be a good time. Kind of stop, pause, but if you want to keep going and talk about Bell Hooks, who is kind of her own unit of postmodernism, that you have your own set of readings questions. So you're reading Bell Hooks's 1990 essay, Postmodern Blackness, and then I also having you read a very short article of hers from 2016 called Moving Beyond Pain, where she sort of gives a famous, or we could say infamous, critique of Beyonce. So very briefly, Bell Hooks herself is an acclaimed intellectual, feminist theorist, cultural critic, artist, and writer. And from an African-American female perspective, her cultural criticism is from her particular standpoint as sort of a Black woman in the United States. She's authored, I think, like 30 books and on cultural criticism and poetry and personal memoirs. She's written children's books, and she writes a lot about popular culture through the lens of the intersection of gender, race, and class. She actually was born Gloria Jean Watkins, and she adopted the name Bell Hooks as her pen name, which was actually the name of maternal great-grandmother. And it's important to know she does not use capitalization for either Bell or either Hooks. She's become kind of a well-known public intellectual in terms of cultural criticism, and is still alive and writing today. So she wrote this essay, Postmodern Blackness, in 1990 as kind of a response to when postmodernism had been this really popular trend in academia at that point for about a decade, focused on what she calls heterogeneity, the decentered subject, and recognition of difference. And also, focusing on holding up marginalized and silenced voices in Western society, supposedly, right? So we talked about that last time with postmodernism. However, Hooks says when actually looking at postmodern writers, philosophers, theorists, and when she was going to conferences about postmodern theory and her colleagues' discussion of postmodernism, she saw a homogeneity in the actual people involved in postmodern theorizing. I mean, really, they were mostly elite white men. And so there's this divergence that she saw between the content of postmodern theory and this sort of holding up marginalized and silenced voices, and the actual practice of who does the theorizing. And especially, in 1990s, she saw very few Black female or even male Black or white female voices in the postmodern academic community. And, Hooks's sort of critique is, this is ironic because postmodern theory sort of questions a lot of these hierarchies and essentialisms. So, questioning the idea of universal truth, the standard set of ideas that is purportedly applicable to everyone, meta-narratives about race, gender, sexual orientation, right? It's supposedly questioning these. But postmodernism in practice for Hooks and for her actual experiences in the sort of academic community of postmodern philosophers and thinkers, was very different than that. And part of that too, she says, is if you read any sort of postmodern theory, which we get a little bit of this class, that a lot of the writing is geared towards very specialized audiences that share a common elite academic language and access to sort of these elite circles. In other words, like getting a PhD in philosophy or literature, is rooted in kind of the very meta narratives that postmodernism claims to challenge. To get a graduate background in philosophy, we can ask who has access to this kind of education, whose voices get heard given within these kinds of structural constraints. And it's clearly typically not marginalized peoples. She also kind of has this secondary critique in postmodern Blackness about essentialism and Blackness. And this is actually an issue that we've talked about in this class. So Hooks sees a potential in postmodern theories for the African-American community and other minority communities, as it allows for questioning and deconstructing categories of concepts like race and ethnicity, and giving space to multiple perspectives within a marginalized community. She argues that postmodernism can create a yearning that can unite everyone undervalued and marginalized. But what do communities lose by questioning essentialism? How do we question essentialism for Hooks without rejecting the idea of the Black experience? So if we're sort of rejecting any kind of essentialism in terms of race or Blackness, then what does the Black experience mean? And what does a Black voice or a Black perspective mean? Can, postmodernism in its sort of easy form deteriorate into, well, if race is a social construct and not an essential part of who we are, then why do we even talk about it? Or I don't see color because it's not real. And you can kind of, see the potential for that. So, Hooks really sees, her main critique is, wow, look at the people doing this theory, about celebrating diversity, and it's not really that diverse. And the barriers to sort of being a part of this community, the academic barriers, really sort of limit a lot of marginalized people. But, postmodernism's questioning of essentialism, what does that mean that marginalized communities lose? If you critique sort of an essential commonality to an experience like the Black experience. And I think those are really important questions to talk about, which hopefully we will in class. So the second essay, I've actually never taught this one before. This is new. I wanted to throw in a little bit of her actual cultural criticism. I assigned the 2016 essay, Moving Beyond Pain. And again, this is a more recent essay where where she engages in a cultural criticism of a specific piece of popular culture or an artist or a body of work, which is often what her work does. So here she got into a lot of trouble for critiquing Beyonce. Oh my God, you can't critique Beyonce. What? So her argument is that while Beyonce is celebrating the visibility of Black women and their stories in her visual album Lemonade, Hooks does point out that Beyonce challenges the history of devaluing Black female bodies. Hooks also has a number of critiques of the visual representation of Black womanhood in Beyonce's videos from this album. So Hooks claims Lemonade also reinforces stereotypes about Black women and their bodies, as well as the irrational emotionality of women. But more importantly, Hooks sees Beyonce's work as problematic because it's a commodity, designed to be sold worldwide and make a rich woman even richer, as well as all the corporations involved in the production and distribution of her music and videos. And this overall system of capitalism for Hooks is particularly exploitative to Black and brown bodies, and that matters to her. So, is Beyonce a feminist icon or problematic from a feminist perspective? Especially from a Black feminist perspective, or perhaps both. So for your assignment, your readings questions, you were to watch either Freedom or Formation music videos from the Lemonade visual album and let us know your view. In Hooks's critique of Beyonce, we see both the influence of a postmodern outlook, right? So the importance of image and representation. But also we see a more materialist Marxist influence, like with Jameson, that pushes deeper beyond this sort of surface plays of images and representation to look at sort of the deeper inequalities that may be reinforced by it, and the way that mass culture products like videos, like albums, like songs, as commodities are exploitative and can reinforce inequalities. And then these inequalities, contra postmodernism, for thinkers like Hooks, have a real and truthful existence. So the back and forth between postmodernism's emphasis on the multiplicity of views and voices, as well as the questioning of the notion of truth and meta-narratives, and perspectives like a more Marxist focus on the underlying material consequences of capitalism, along with, a continued investment in meta-narratives of class conflict, really underpinned a lot of the philosophical debates in the late 20th and early 20th century. So one thing that we can discuss in classes, where we fall on this debate. At what point is deconstructing everything too far? At what point can we both sort of critique meta-narratives and tear apart what needs to be torn apart? But is there still something, such as the truth of, let's say, exploitation, or the truth of discrimination, or the truth of the critique of capitalism embedded in theorists like Jameson and like Hooks? And how do we kind of balance both of those perspectives? So I will see you guys in class to talk about all of these really deep philosophical questions that have to do with postmodernism. See you in class. Bye.